Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on HVSBL podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Jennifer Bird, and we're going to be talking about marriage in the Bible.
And before we continue, if you haven't already subscribed, subscribe to Jennifer Bird's YouTube channel. Her YouTube channel will be tagged in the description below, so click on the tag and it'll take you to her channel, and you can subscribe.
So thank you for joining me today, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me, Jacob. Yeah.
So can you tell us what's going on at SBL with marriage in the Bible?
Well, there's a panel this afternoon reviewing my book, Marriage in the Bible. So I will do a quick intro talking a little bit about what I'm up to or why I decided to write this book and what I think some of the primary takeaways are from the book that I think are helpful and contribute to scholarship in some way, shape, or form. And then there are 5 or 6, I can't recall, biblical scholars, both Hebrew Bible and Newer Testament, who will respond to it, engage it in some way critically, I hope. And I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So one person is actually going to be on Zoom, not projected, but just on a laptop, sitting on the podium. I appreciate her willingness to be flexible with that. So, yeah.
I want to recap, because we have discussed marriage in the Bible in a previous virtual interview.
Yeah.
So obviously it's about marriage in the Bible. So I don't have to ask what it necessarily is about. That's self-explanatory.
Right.
But I'll ask it in a different way. So when you go into the Bible and you look at passages that talk about being married or a husband or a couple people becoming a couple, what does the Bible say about that? Does the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament conflict on marriage?
Okay, so the first question, what does it say about getting married?
Yes.
Very little. Okay. And that's part of the point of doing a book like this is let's look at what's actually being talked about. There's very little that's said, but what is said is in the Hebrew Bible, and it is about a woman being purchased from her father by a man. And it's an economic exchange. It's about this man being able to have able to have children, and it's about him having a way to have sex. That's really what it boils down to, biblically speaking. And so looking at the ways, the relationships that are talked about, what are they modeling? What kinds of things are assumed to be okay in a marriage, in this partnering relationship? Those are all important things to me that I'm trying to highlight for people. Let's take seriously how differently they handled this relationship we call marriage. Let's look at that, be really honest about that. And then we can take a step back and say, okay, how are we doing things differently today, right? Is this actually helpful content for us? Do we want what the Bible is saying about marriage to inform what we think is okay or what we want to endorse today? So that's the primary starting point for me, is just being very serious and honest about how different the biblical texts are. They're different in terms of the names for people, like the way people are labeled, whether they're single or married. We have lots of ways to talk about people being single or married because that distinction matters to us. It didn't matter yet in their language. So there isn't a distinction between a woman who is not yet married and a woman who is married. She's just a woman both times. There's no separate noun for wife. Same is true for men. A man is a man before he takes a woman, purchases a woman, and he's a man after he takes a woman. There's no separate noun to say now he's a husband, right? There are verbs, and the issue of verbs that are used is also part of this conversation, in terms of there isn't a verb that's actually specifically separate to say marry. There's just take. A man takes a woman, literally. And there are other verbs as well that are even more kind of domineering for a man over a woman and her body. So that's the first thing, is let's be very honest about how they seemed to imagine this relationship. They talked about it differently than we do. That in and of itself is really important, right? Language is powerful. Language matters. So that's your first question. What was the second question? I meant to tag it.
Was there a difference between what the Hebrew Bible says and the New Testament?
Yeah. What's interesting about that, and I think that's a really important question, is there are some bits in the Newer Testament that endorse more equality between a man and a woman in a paired up relationship. So we have in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, there are these comments in that it's better for a man not to touch a woman. That's the premise that's laid out, and Paul and his letter writing buddies are going to respond to that. Well, that's all about sex. That actually isn't about marriage. That's just whether or not a man should have sex. And really, as far as we know, in context, it's likely within a marriage, it's better not to have sex. That's the question that's being posed. And because some people thought they were more holy by abstaining from sex, even in a marriage relationship. So in that conversation, Paul has all these different scenarios and possibilities and, whatever. He has all kinds of reasoning that he puts out there. There is kind of an indirect notion of men and women are actually equals in this relationship. That's different from the rest of the Bible, right? So there is this moment, and it's the only one you get in the whole Bible. But that is in there, so it's worth pointing out. But then there are more passages in the Newer Testament that reflect what's in the Hebrew Bible, right? Or that are, if there's a moment in the early movement of this sect of Judaism that worships Jesus, where there was equality, then we have, at the end of the first century, we have people writing in Paul's name, returning to a hierarchical relationship, returning to and kind of imposing on everyone the patriarchal norms, right? So you have that happening in the Pauline letters. You have the words attributed to Jesus in the Gospels that are very much going to reflect what's in the Hebrew Bible. There isn't a lot attributed to Jesus in the Newer Testament that is talking about marriage at all. And when he is depicted talking about it, it's primarily the issue around, it's two things. The Pharisees have said, hey, what about this scenario when a man takes a woman, marries a woman, and he dies without her having children, and all 6 of his brothers marry her also? To whom does she belong in heaven, right? So they're not even really asking about marriage. They're actually talking about the issue of resurrection, right? Oh. Yeah. So it's posing a thing. And, Jesus doesn't pause to say, I think we should do away with this idea, by the way, this levirate marriage thing. It's really hard on the women. He doesn't say that because in the context, the conversations around this theological issue around resurrection. So Jesus seems to endorse levirate marriage, which is frightening. Like, shouldn't we not be okay with that?
Right.
So there's that. And then the other time that it comes up is when he's posed with a similar question. Posed with a question, for which reason are you okay with divorce, Jesus, is what it's saying. I'm paraphrasing. It's not saying it that directly, but there's a conversation that's already happening, has been for a couple hundred years. And so some of these Jewish leaders are asking him, well, which reason for divorce are you okay with? And he responds by saying, well, actually, I don't think there should be divorce, yada, yada. But what I care about is the reason he gives for why divorce is not okay. And the reason he gives circles back to a woman's body is territory to mark by men. Because the issue for him there is divorce is not okay because you're going to remarry, meaning you're going to have sex with someone else. And so even in the words of Jesus, the conversation, the language, the concerns are all about sex and bodies and claiming a body. Men in the Hebrew Bible, men claim a woman, they take her home, have sex with her. Now everybody knows he's marked his territory, she's his. That's still in there in the language that's attributed to Jesus. So when I talk about this with people, I like to highlight that people of faith, Jewish and Christian faiths, are informed to think about marriage primarily through the lens of sex. That's what your scriptures teach you. That's what, there's a reason why a lot of people, and I say this coming from a Christian background, but it happens for Jews as well, right? That's what's modeled in the Hebrew Bible. But for Christians, it's also this Newer Testament stuff that the conversation that gets closest to marriage is focused on sex. No wonder people today primarily think about this conversation around marriage when it comes to like this issue of marriage equality. They're thinking about what kind of sex is being had, by whom, to what end. Because their scriptures, that's all their scriptures give them room to think about, right? So the heading in that chapter of 1 Corinthians 7, the heading in almost every Bible, not everyone, but the heading will say something like advice about marriage, something about marriage, and the chapter is just talking about whether or not you should have sex. Like, people of faith are being trained to think from a very young age, are being trained to think about sex is the primary thing for marriage, which is simply not true. On a kind of a normal relational functional level, right? Go ask 10 couples, what's the most important thing in your marriage, right? Sex is probably important, but it's not the only thing. And it's not the thing that defines it. Many people in the Western traditions have been taught to prioritize that because of these traditions and these texts that only focus on that. So for me, that's one of the most important things, actually, is inviting people to see that that's what's playing out in these texts, so that you can separate sex and sexual engagement, sexual intercourse from the framework and language of marriage. Those two do not have to be intertwined or solely defined by each other, but many people are taught that they are because of the way it's handled in the Bible.
And how is it reinterpreted today by the various different Christian denominations?
Yeah, most Christian denominations are still putting out there this idea of no sex before marriage, right? Sex needs, no children outside of marriage. And it's in part because of these ancient ideas, right? Procreation only happens in marriage. Sex is only proper within a marriage. That is wholly human construct, right? Over bodies and control of bodies. Primarily women's, given women are the ones who can produce children. Right. Women are the ones whose bodies are deemed pure or impure based on whether or not they've had sexual relations. Like, men's bodies aren't marked in the same way, right? So I will talk about sex separate from a married scenario around Christian people in a church context, and it makes them entirely uncomfortable. I think only the most progressive church denominations are willing to talk about sex outside of marriage as being okay. Just that alone is kind of mind-numbing, when you stop to think about it. It is not okay before marriage or outside of. Really? That is how deeply ingrained these biblical norms are for people even still today.
And how do you think that can affect Paul? Because I've asked you about Paul in the past, and how Paul is interpreted from what many believe is an interpolation in 1 Corinthians and 1 Corinthians 14. I believe that's where it is. Can you talk about that a little bit?
The interpolation, 1 Corinthians chapter 14. So that's an issue about, that is an issue about women and wives and asking their husbands at home. And that's really more about leadership in the church than it is, but it is related to married.
That's why I asked.
Yeah, it is related to it. It's not the primary thing. Sorry, I need to take a moment here to sort that out. So, what is it you wanted me to discuss about that? I'm sorry. I'm just trying to wrap my head around the question.
Does it give a hint about how Paul understands marriage based on what he was saying about women in that passage?
Oh, I see. Well, as you well know, actually, now at least from that conversation, I think with Joseph Wilson, yes,
it's sort of a recap.
It's sort of a recap. And it's what you're doing, and it's a hard thing for me to talk about, to be honest. But so, what does Paul think of women is a really interesting question to me, right? What did he think of women? And I think that he was probably a very typical decently well-educated male, Jewish for sure, but he's also interacting in Gentile spaces. I think he was probably a pretty typical human, meaning he had seen some spaces where women were empowered and could see and appreciate perhaps that that's valuable. He perhaps knew women who were disciples of rabbis, perhaps, right? He may have known of those women because there were, right? So he may have been exposed to spaces both in his own tradition that were progressive, perhaps. He most likely knew of many other religious traditions that embodied or embraced women as leaders, and he could see a value in that, perhaps. I don't know if he did or not, but I could see that's a possibility. And so I think that there are moments in Paul's writings that endorse women that are seemingly very pro-women, right? And in the same letters, he's also putting women down, or he's also frustrated with women who are taking up positions of leadership or positions of power, and they're not looking the way he wanted them to or thought that they would. And so he's dialing it back, or he's kind of giving a little side eye rhetorically, right? Or he's telling people, he's finding ways to limit rhetorically what women are allowed to do. So what I'm trying to dance around here is, I know plenty of people, male and female and non-binary, but mostly male, and certainly a handful of female, right? Mostly male, who think that they're feminists, or they think that they're okay with women. They think that they're, supportive of women, and they want to support women, and they believe in them and all this stuff. But when it comes down to it, when you get to some of the specifics of what that then looks like, it makes them uncomfortable, and they dial it back, right? Because they're the ones with the power. I interact with these people all the time. So the fact that it's like it happens today, I think it's important to say that it happens today. So give the little bit of grain of salt, or at least have some understanding when you see that happening in Paul. However, we still need to be very clear that it's happening in Paul, right? And I don't just mean, the genuine Paul to the Deutero, he shifts. That does happen dramatically. Genuine Paul is where you have this moment of equality in 1 Corinthians, and this thing about Galatians 3:28, that's shown up quite a bit this weekend, actually. There have been 2 different panels where that was the main theme, was talking about Galatians 3:28. Really, I wasn't able to attend that panel, and it's shown up in a couple other papers that I know of outside of that panel. So people want to talk about, in Galatians 3:28, he says, in Christ, there is no longer slave or free. There is no longer Jew or Gentile. That's the main issue for him. But then he also includes no longer male, slave or free, no longer male and female. And so people make a big deal of this idea that in Christ, the genderedness doesn't matter. So people do make a big deal of this idea in Paul's letters because it seems very egalitarian. It seems very, endorsing of women. In the same letter as 1 Corinthians 7, later on in chapter 11 and chapter 14, there is this kind of, he's more ambivalent, or even, depending on how you read what you were referring to in the posing of this question, that segment in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 is, our verses, the second half of verse 33 through 36, is that an interpolation? So something that showed up in the marginalia that was the next time copied put into the body of the letter, or was it original to the letter? That's the conversation or the debate among scholars. And people have different ways of interpreting it or reading it if it was originally marginalia and put in. There's 2 different ways to read the fact that it shows up in the margin, if that's what we're going to say. 2 different ways to read even that. And so lots of things being said. And so I'm more interested, instead of saying this is what that meant, I am more interested in saying, well, what this shows us is, even in Paul's own writings, the genuine Paul, there's animosity towards women, as well as egalitarianism or equality among men and women, between men and women in Paul. So he's like a lot of the men I know today. meanwhile, think that they're supportive of women being equals, but they don't realize to what extent that actually isn't the case, even in their own thinking or the way they interact with people.
So, what would you recommend to readers to try to understand the marriage in the Bible properly? Well, there's that.
There's that. Well, okay. So, marriage in the Bible, to understand it properly, I guess I have two different thoughts on that. One is go read the Patriarch. Go read the book of Genesis, right? Read through that and set aside any of your prior presuppositions about what Genesis says to people in terms of how it's modeling marriage for people. Set aside anything that you come into that conversation with. Just acknowledge it and set it all aside. And then go read it very slowly, and reflectively, starting in chapter 12 of Genesis all the way to the end. Because what's actually happening there over and over again is that men are in control of women's bodies. I mean, it starts in Genesis chapter 12. Genesis 12 has this thing, the announcement to Abram to go, I'm going to do all these great things for you and go leave your home and start out, do your own thing. And I'm going to bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Like, just be reflective, critical thinking here. Really? Okay, I'm not sure I'm okay with that. And keep moving and see what happens within the first 10 verses of the whole story. The whole story. Abram, Sarai, Abram pimps her out to save his life. Period. End of story. Like, just that. What does that tell you? How would that go over today? What are we seeing? And as much as I want to judge or critique Abram for that, I also don't think we should, because that's my point, is that was allowable. That was okay, right? Just sit with that for a minute. They have an enslaved person among their property, Hagar. And the story says that Sarai is like, I'm not sure I'm pushing a baby out at my age, so go have sex with Hagar, and maybe her child we can rear as our own, fully disregarding Hagar as a person, any kind of consent to this scenario. Specific to this tradition, I think it's important we look at that and think about that. That actually means that we would give Abram a label for that, right? Today begins with an R. Also, that's telling us that was a practice, right? It's also telling us something about their culture in that context. That on a certain level, I want to critique that. On a certain level, I want us to just be honest about that. That was something they could do. That's something people have done. So both, I want to hold that in tension, right? It's not okay with me, but let's be honest. That's a thing people have done. Now, both of those are happening in this moment, in this story. That's biblical. That's biblical. It's not just biblical. It's like the guy that got the whole thing started. He pimps out his wife. Next moment, he's having sex with someone on the side in his own house. Everybody's okay with it. That's a biblical marriage right there. Like, that's what I think is really helpful, right? The other side of what I've done in this book is for people today who want to talk about, air quotes, biblical marriage. There are 4 passages. It's usually a Christian. I've never heard a Jewish person use the phrase biblical marriage, and it could be that that's happening in Jewish spaces, but I don't know of it. So it's usually Christian. So it's both testaments, and there are 4 passages that people think of when they use that phrase biblical marriage. Genesis 1:28, Genesis 2:24, Matthew 19:4-6, which is in a larger conversation that goes from verse 3 to 12, and then Ephesians 5:31 and 32, which is also in a longer segment. So we're cherry picking out of the passages to begin with. So people think these 4 passages define biblical marriage. Well, let's look at what those passages are actually doing. Those verses in their context, what are they actually talking about? And it isn't usually what people are assuming that those verses are endorsing, right? Just quick, I'm not going to go through all four of them, but just as an example, Genesis 1:28 is the verse that says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Well, people say that's about marriage. Why? Because people are having sex. It's not about marriage. That's about two people, or that's about people, getting together, reproducing, all that stuff. 2 verses earlier, or 6 verses earlier, God says this, in the story, God says the same thing to the fish of the sea, and and in saying it to the humans, it's saying it to all the land animals. Be fruitful and multiply. That's just a thing. That's just endorsing. That's just saying, go do the thing that's already in your genetics to go do, right? It's reproduce, be plentiful, multiply. For a group of people who are constantly being conquered by outside forces and are very vulnerable as a people, go produce numbers is a good idea. But that doesn't mean that be fruitful can only happen in a marriage. These are just two very different conversations that are being kind of collapsed onto each other. Genesis 1:28 isn't talking about sex is only for marriage, but that's how people read it. There's no marriage going on in Genesis 1 at all. There's no marrying happening. There's no pairing up. It's just be fruitful, do your thing, right? So people are, and this was happening by the 2nd, 3rd century BCE within Jewish conversations, that reading Genesis 1:28 and 2:24 as defining marriage, that was already happening by then. So it was probably happening earlier than that as well, right? That's not what it's talking about, though. And so I think it was for me very empowering to be able to sit with some of these really important and formative verses, right? And see that they're not actually doing what I thought they're doing, right? So, I think that the first 4 chapters of the book are really important for people who want to better understand these conversations. So if any of your readers have heard that people say, I want a biblical marriage, or I think we should I think only biblical marriages are appropriate, or whatever. Like, those first 4 chapters are really important to help you see better what's going on in the verses that Christians, at least, turn to say, this is what I mean by that. It doesn't actually say what you think it says. In fact, that was actually almost the subtitle. It's too snarky, and that's why my editors talked me out of it. But initially, the subtitle was going to be, I do not think it means what you think it means. Yeah.
I'll have the affiliate link to purchase marriage in the Bible in the description below, and also permission granted and pen comment. And also to your YouTube channel.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Jennifer.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.